Washington Journal continues.
Tara Copp is Pentagon Bureau Chief for the Military Times, joining us to discuss the Trump administration's plan to deploy U.S. military troops to the southern border. Tara Copp, first explain what we know about the size of this mission and what that mission is actually going to be.
Sure. Some of the specifics are that they're active duty forces, and that's important. We'll get to that in a second. And we're looking at about 700 to 800 troops to augment the already 2,000 National Guard that are already at the border. Those were dispatched earlier this year. Secretary Mattis authorized their deployment to the border to help Customs and Border Patrol agents down there.
Where are these new troops going?
They'll be anywhere along the Texas-Mexico border. They can extend all the way to California. So there's several different, major checkpoints where they look for traffic, but basically they're going to be backfilling. You're not going to have active duty troops armed on the border looking for people crossing the river or whatnot. You're going to have them in administrative positions. You're going to have them providing aviation support. There might be some helicopters or some surveillance. You'll have them potentially in motor pools assisting with getting the different vehicles out that are, get pretty beat up riding along the border all day long and monitoring.
Why is it important that these are active duty troops?
There's an 1878 law, Posse Comitatus Act, that forbids federalized troops from acting in a law enforcement function in a state. So the reason that National Guard troops were initially sent, and they were mostly from 4 different countries, from Texas, from New Mexico, from Arizona, and from California. Those are the predominant border states, but those troops are authorized by their governors, and they're under their governor's control, therefore not violating the act. If you send in active duty forces that are under Secretary Mattis's control, those are federal active duty troops, and they cannot conduct those law enforcement activities.
So let's talk about the organization of those troops and the role that the governors are going to play then here. Okay,
so initially when Secretary Mattis authorized the National Guard troops, the governors could have sent up to 4,000 to the border, but I think you probably remember there was some hesitation. It became a little bit of a political issue. A lot of governors didn't want to send troops. Ultimately, the 4 border states, Texas provided the most of them. They provided about 1,000 of them. The other 3 states, a couple hundred apiece. So this time, Secretary Mattis is sending active duty. That way you don't have to ask the governors, and it's an immediate response and ability to basically spin up fast and get down there.
I should note for our viewers that you were part of an overseas trip this past weekend with Secretary Mattis. Just got back last night. We're glad you're here. Did you have a chance to talk to him about this specific issue?
We did. He is, when we travel with him, he does make himself available to the reporters, and so we sat with him for about 30 minutes while we were flying, and then again we had a press conference with him in the Czech Republic yesterday where I asked him about this issue. While we were flying with him, we asked him, why are we sending active duty and what will they be doing? And he was very clear to say that they hadn't come to a final decision on the roles, how the troops will be governed, but they would not be in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, and that they look at basically every single deployment to make sure it's in line with that law.
We're talking with Tara Copp of Military Times, Pentagon Bureau Chief, about the deployment of U.S. troops to the border. If you want to call in and join the conversation, lines as usual. Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, Independents 202-748-8002. You can start calling in now. Tara Copp, as folks are calling in, who pays for these active duty and reserve troops on the border?
Sure. Well, because Secretary Mattis authorized the initial National Guard troops, they are under the governor's authority, but they're going to be reimbursed with federal funds. With active duty, that's just federal taxpayer dollars. So,
do we have a sense of how much this deployment and the previous one is costing?
We don't yet. We're still looking for that number.
In terms of the kinds of deployments that have happened of U.S. troops to the border in the past, take us through not just this administration, but past administrations as well, when this has happened.
So it happened during President Obama's term. It happened during President Bush's term. When there seemed to be kind of a, quote-unquote crisis at the border where there was an influx of immigrants or undocumented kids, U.S. military facilities and personnel have been used to help the Customs and Border agents deal with that influx. So, for example, between 2016 and 2017, there were thousands of undocumented kids that were held at Fort Bliss, Texas. And so the idea that the military is brand new to this now is just not the case. They've frequently been asked to help.
In past administrations, during the Obama administration, were there state governors who pushed back against this, like we saw some of these governors doing to the Trump administration?
No, that's kind of the interesting debate here, and I think it's because of the larger and heated immigration debate going on, is that the use of these troops has become much more of a political issue than it was in the past.
And we can talk about it in the next 20 minutes this morning. Tara Copp with us, having this conversation about this mission, this deployment of U.S. troops to the border. Connie's up first in Brookville, Maryland, a Democrat. Good morning.
Yes, hello, thank you. I would first like to know, how far is the caravan away from the U.S. border? And second, I'd like your take on the feeling that many people have that this is being done for political reasons and not for safety or security reasons.
Tara Copp.
Well, as of a few days ago, it was about 1,000 miles away from the border, and they're currently about 95 miles inside Mexico. This caravan's traveling primarily on foot. They do get some vehicle support, but it's not a fast-moving caravan. And at the current rate of speed, I do not think that they're going to reach the U.S. border by Election Day. That doesn't keep it from being an election issue, and particularly because we're just a week out or so, it obviously is being looked at through a political lens. So is it a political issue? I guess that's how, whether you look at it like that or not.
What was Secretary Mattis's defense when you asked him that question?
So we don't ask Secretary Mattis political questions, basically. But his response really was this was a request from DHS. And because they asked him to fulfill this request, he did.
For folks who haven't covered the Pentagon, why not ask him some of those political questions?
Well, the military is apolitical, and the quickest way to shut down a conversation is to try and get Secretary Mattis or any of the predecessors to wade into a political debate.
What will he do?
He will just shut down, basically. I mean, you want to engage, you want to get facts, you want to ask him, what will these troops be doing? Will they be armed? Will they not be armed? That's kind of a question that's really bothered people. Where you're going to have armed military personnel, with the big trucks and the armored vests, intimidating mothers, children, fathers who are trying to escape violence. And, right now, the predominant amount of troops that will be there are not going to be armed. Some of them may be for self-defense, but those are the things that we try to unravel with the Secretary. We don't try to engage him in the larger political debate.
Jerry is in Wallace, Texas, a Democrat. Good morning.
Yes, I'm on.
Yes, sir, Jerry. Go ahead. You're on with Tara Copp.
Yes. Okay. The question that I have is, we're sending a lot of troops, and these are just people walking with children, little backpacks, no armor, no guns, no nothing. And you could just stand there with a truck and stop these people from crossing the border. Why are we spending thousands of dollars on fuel, thousands of dollars on troops for people and their kids, and they're just women, and they're just refugees. They're just trying to get to someplace safe for themselves. But we're going to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. I was in the military. I know that it's real easy to stop that caravan. I could do it with a deuce and a half and a dozen people. I don't need no thousands of troops on the border to stop these people from crossing.
Tara Copp.
Well, I'm not sure a deuce and a half and a dozen people would stop 7,000 migrants, but the real question is that this order is being fulfilled because the president requested it. So the why really should be addressed to the White House. Why did they want active duty troops instead of requesting an additional round of National Guard? It may be that because, the president can't force the governors to send National Guard troops, but the president is the commander-in-chief of the active duty military and very much so can request and direct that active duty forces be sent to the border.
What have we heard from some of the folks on the ground who are already there at the border, the Department of Homeland Security officials or the Border Patrol officers? What are they saying about this? Do they want those active duty and reserve troops there?
They definitely need support. I mean, the number of apprehensions along the border is up. There was about 310,000 apprehensions last year. That's up to about 396,000 in fiscal year 18. So there is a larger amount of traffic. This also is a more political issue. You've seen a lot of heated rhetoric and tension along the border, particularly at some of the facilities that were used to house children. And so for anything, National Guard is probably the best use of forces down there, but active duty is what we're going to be dealing with.
Benton Harbor, Michigan. Willie's next, a Democrat. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Hello, I'm calling because I'm trying to figure out what do we supposed to do about all the cases that the government has been found guilty on and still hasn't did anything about yet.
What specific cases are you referring to, Willie?
Talking about kidnapping, wiretapping, all these things.
So, Willie, we're talking about the deployment of U.S. troops to the border. That's our topic with Tara Copp, Military Times Pentagon Bureau Chief. We're going to stick to those topics just so we have her expertise for just about 15 more minutes. Bob, go ahead. South Boston, Virginia, Independent.
Yes, good morning. I appreciate you being on there this morning answering questions. I've heard reports that many of these folks that are heading up to the U.S. border are being transported by buses and other transports, and most of the time you see them when they're traveling on TV. It's these are for photo ops, and I just wanted to ask her whether or not she'd heard any of these reports. And another thing, Mexico's already said that they would give these folks asylum, and I'm kind of curious as to why they haven't. I appreciate it.
Tara Copp.
Well, for many of the migrants, an arrival in Mexico isn't enough. I mean, there's an a level of violence in Mexico that people are trying to escape in Mexico to come to the United States as they are from Honduras and Guatemala. So for them, the ultimate journey isn't to end up in Mexico, it's to end up in our country where they have new opportunities potentially to start fresh. As far as the caravan goes, yes, there are buses and there have been trucks that have helped some of these people keep moving. I mean, they're walking 1,000 miles. That's just slightly under walking if we wanted to walk the East Coast to the West Coast. So they're still making the journey to the border. I guess the caller is insinuating that maybe this is like an orchestrated effort to get migrants to do a big photo op. But from what we have seen, these are genuinely families that are just looking for help and looking for a new opportunity.
We know President Trump has reached out to leaders in Mexico about the caravan and having discussions about that. Have any U.S. officials tried to reach out to the leaders of that caravan itself to kind of make contact to try to warn them off before they get to the United States?
Well, Trump has tweeted at the caravan, but the irony there is that very few of the people traveling have an iPhone that they can look at the tweet and respond back. So tweeting is probably not the best way to communicate with these thousands of migrants. Once they get to the border, there's going to be a lot more, I think, direct discussion and with agents themselves, with the Mexican government. So this part of the story hasn't really happened yet.
And remind us again who leads those discussions if and when they get to the border. Who will be sort of the first contact?
It's really one-on-one. I mean, once you get to a port of entry and you're requesting asylum, it's your individual case. There's files that you have to fill out. That's why there's all this administrative backfill and support that will be needed, especially if the number of migrants that actually reach will be as large as expected.
But is the goal still to have the Customs and Border Patrol officers lead that sort of first contact as opposed to these military troops?
Exactly. Under Secretary Mattis's orders, both the active duty and the Guard troops are not authorized to interact with the migrants at all.
Alvin's up next in New Orleans, Louisiana, Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I've served in the United States Army for 27 and a half years. I was a senior non-commissioned officer in the top commissioned officers in the 7th Army. And I don't see the point that these guys in the National Guard taken away from their families to go bivouac out in the middle of rattlesnake country and bringing the first to deploy, and I'm pretty sure they're going to probably come from the 82nd Airborne, which is the first to deploy. This is nothing but pure OD politics. Those National Guard people should not be out there the United States Army should not deploy no active duty people down there behind a bunch of crap. And I was in Europe when the time we had to go into Bosnia and represent. But we didn't do none of this foolishness over there. They went there for a purpose. Now these guys are going out there with rifles and everything. Here you got a bunch of people coming over with little bitty children looking for a better life. And anybody with common sense knows it'll take you 3 months to walk 1,000 miles. That's if you are lucky. This is pure old dirty politics. Thank you.
It's Alvin in Louisiana. Tara Copp.
So earlier we were talking about previous instances of presidents requesting active duty support. In 1997, Marines assisting Customs and Border Patrol agents fatally shot a 17-year-old kid who was herding goats, and that really that kind of changed the discussion as to whether you should have active duty troops on the border and whether or not these troops should be armed. So this has happened before. There's a broader political debate. Yes, is this a stunt or not? The question for the Department of Defense is the president requested it and they're fulfilling it.
What was the resolution of that case where the 17-year-old was shot?
Well, he didn't survive, and the Marines were charged.
And what happened with the Marines who were charged? Did they end up in prison?
I think there was a court-martial. I don't remember.
Don's up next in Homewood, Illinois. Independent. Good morning.
Good morning. My question really deals with what if the people trying to get into this country ignore the 8,000 soldiers we have on it? Are the soldiers going to open fire on that group, or what's going to happen in this case?
Well, as I said previously, the vast majority of the troops that will be on the border are not armed. Their purposes there are for administrative support, for helping get the vast amount of data collection and files that will be needed for all of these people. And I know that's not what you typically envision your military doing, but they will also be doing things like flying helicopters overhead to do surveillance and doing the logistical support so that the actual agents, the agents that are trained in actually processing people through and handling these cases, can get to do that.
What about building the wall? Could any of these troops be used in that effort?
So there is construction material headed down. Already some Jersey barriers are being sent down to the border. And yes, there are engineering troops that can help with assisting with any part of the wall that's already built. There's also a training range in Arizona where that is federal land, it's military property, and they're looking at potentially bolstering that as part of a enhanced wall.
Reno, Nevada. Stan, Independent, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Great to be on with you. And this is something that has a historical perspective. The beginnings of this, one of the beginnings of this, was back in 2009 when the president of Honduras attempted to do what Hugo Chavez did, tried to secretly distribute ballots, get elected for another term. And that was called correctly by the government of Honduras an unconstitutional act. So the constitutionally directed Supreme Court and the Senate acted as they should to stop him. Now, if they did it in a way that's not like ours, if it wasn't a long legal process, impeachment process, that's unfortunate, but they did it according to their law.
So, Stan, bring us to today and the deployment of these troops.
Well, we have to understand the beginnings, and we have to understand the history, and it should be reported on. I'm a little upset that more of the reporting doesn't speak to why these people have an economy that's shattered, somewhat because of our State Department, and they lost loans, they lost farm aid, they lost World Bank financing because they were branded a rogue state incorrectly by our State Department. So we need to understand our shortfall in that aspect. We need to understand that they're people. They probably shouldn't all come at once, but we could restore some of the trust. They were a great ally. They helped us in these political struggles with Nicaragua. We have a base there. We could train some of these young men on that base to be policemen, soldiers, more states of the statesmen that they need to work with us in a democratic way.
Got your point, Stan. Tara Copp, on the reporting of the history of this, and also Secretary Mattis's thoughts as well on the relationships with these countries where the vast majority of these migrants are coming from.
Sure. Well, I mean, the United States has been a haven for migrants escaping both domestic, harsh, when they have problems in their countries. For centuries, immigrants have come here escaping the problems from their past, and we've welcomed them. The overall number of immigrants coming in from Latin America and South America has vastly dropped over the last 10 years, but it's still, like I said, about 400,000. As far as Secretary Mattis, he just got back from a trip to South America, and to him, it's important to keep those relationships strong because there's actually a rising amount of influence from both Russia and China in South America right now. And the U.S. has typically enjoyed a very healthy relationship with most of the countries down there. So again, it's just a point of being able to secure the border, but not make somebody feel like you're unwelcome just because you come from another country.
Speaking of Secretary Mattis, I wonder if you've chatted with him at all about how long he intends to stay in that job.
We ask and we ask and we ask. And of course, there's a lot of speculation that he's going to go. There's an article probably every other week that he's going to go. He's told us he's committed to staying. He's also told us he takes it one day at a time. So unfortunately, we haven't been very successful at reading his mind.
What's his usual response? Does he shut down those questions too? Like you said, he shuts down some of the political questions?
He usually makes a joke, So usually he laughs. He'll tease us that he's actually going to go buy a house right down the Potomac, so he never ever leaves. He talks about how he was really enjoying retirement in California, in Washington State, and maybe it's time to go back, but he's not showing his hand one way or another.
Only a couple minutes left with Tara Copp of the Military Times. South Carolina's next. Russell is a Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. And thanks for taking my call. As an Air Force veteran, we were taught that America's borders should be Canada and South America, and that if we keep very tight relationships with Canada and all of Latin America and South America, we would be a lot safer because our natural borders of the ocean would protect us from invaders. And I see that the current administration has tried to destroy our relationship with Canada, and they're not sending the help for police to mitigate the violence in Latin America. They're not working with those countries to mitigate that violence. It seems to me that those people, the reason that those people are trying to get to America is the fault of the current administration by defunding the State Department and not helping the Latin American countries deal with violence. You remember all the previous presidents worked with the police departments of Honduras, Venezuela, Nicaragua to make sure that violence was mitigated in those countries. And that's my comment this morning. Thank you.
It's Russell in South Carolina. Was there anything you wanted to pick up on?
Sure. He raises an important point that, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean have acted as natural barriers that have kept the country relatively safe. And of course, that's no longer the case in this very highly globalized world. The one point that I did want to bring up is a couple of weeks ago, the president mentioned that there might be Middle Easterners in this caravan and that there might be this, terrorist threat that's hiding in this caravan. And then his own administration kind of walked that back and said there's no proof. There have been people from the Middle East and from Africa and from even North Korea that have found their way into the U.S. through the Mexico border. About 16,000 were apprehended in 2016, according to DHS statistics. Now, there has not been evidence of them being connected to terrorism. They just found their way into the U.S. that way. But there's, there is a point that we have become a much more interconnected world, and you can travel to Mexico and you can go into the U.S. through Mexico, just like you can travel to Canada and enter the Mexico that way, or enter the United States that way.
Back to border state, to San Antonio, Texas. Roy, Independent. Go ahead.
Yes, this is Roy. I served 27 years in the military. I lived in like 6 foreign countries and 7 states. When I stayed single a long time, so they sent me, where they can't send married guys and all that. But the thing is, people are just missing the whole point. It's not that these countries are not safe or that, because we're not safe here in San Antonio. My God, there's murders every morning and everything. But it's just overpopulation, and the same thing has happened in North Africa, and it's happened in Jimmy Carter said it in '80 that it's the more will change our country more, that he these states and that they do not allow birth control or any things. That's the way when I was a kid in Pennsylvania, you couldn't even buy condoms, and that's the way it is in the South there. So the birth rate is so high they can't possibly find jobs for these people.
That's Roy in Texas. Let's see if we can get in Carol in Pittsville, Maryland. Democrat, good morning.
Good morning. I just have a comment. If they have funds for the military to go down there, why don't they use the funds to help the people? That if they let them come and use those funds that they were going to fight them with to help them when they get here. That's my comment. That's all I have.
Carol in Maryland, our last caller. Tara Copp.
It's a fascinating point that the military seems to be the solution to this instead of going through a diplomatic route. State Department, of course, State Department has a lot of aid programs throughout the world, but they've seen their funding cut dramatically over the last couple of years. So right now it seems like this administration is leaning more toward a military solution rather than a humanitarian aid one.
In this deployment, when are the new troops starting to arrive, and are you planning to head down to the border at some point to report on it?
Right now, I don't have plans to head down there, but they are expected there later this week.
Tara Copp is Pentagon Bureau Chief for the Military Times. It's militarytimes.com. Thanks so much for the time.
Sure, thanks.